Well, it's likely that you looked at the Gospel of Matthew either in Synoptic Gospels or in Introduction to the New Testament. It's important for us to just take a look at a couple of the basic characteristics of this Gospel narrative. Harrington, in his Sacropagina commentary, describes Matthew's Gospel as a Jewish commentary. He cites, in his argument for this, Old Testament and other Jewish texts that have influenced Matthew or with which Matthew parallels his narrative. He also talks about the fact that Matthew's Gospel is characterized by tension with other Jewish groups, and so he sees the Gospel as part of an internal dispute about the nature of Judaism. He also, for that reason, warns us that as we look at the Gospel, one of the most important things we have to consider is the possibility that people have, and might even now, misread the Gospel to justify anti-Semitic ideas. Harrington's argument is that the Gospel is not anti-Semitic, nor is it anti-Jewish, but there is a history there that has to be taken into account, and we have to try to understand. The text and the language of Matthew differs somewhat from Mark. Matthew's Greek often appears to be better than that of Mark, so a deliberate improvement or editing over the Greek of Mark and even Q. It is, as we saw in Mark, very biblical Greek, so it has many links with the Septuagint. It is Semitic Greek insofar as there are some Hebrew idioms or expressions that show through, but these are all explainable as references to the Septuagint rather than to any idea of a Hebrew source. As was the case in Mark, the narrative here is a simple, straightforward style, and it has a biblical rhythm to it, so the very typical and this happened, and then that happened, that we find in the Old Testament as well. There is a tradition that Matthew was translated from Hebrew or Aramaic. However, there are few scholars that would hold to this position today. There's no evidence for it in the text. The canonical text, as it's ever been known to us, has always been in Greek. And while there was one medieval Jewish text in Hebrew, it's likely that that was provided as an attempt on the part of Christians to convert Jews to the Christian faith. Matthew's Gospel differs from Mark in its structural composition, also in its sources. So the main, most obvious difference between the two Gospels is that Matthew is structured around 5 large blocks of speech or discourse material, each one ending with a similar formula when Jesus finished these words. There are others who debate whether Matthew 23, the woes against the scribes and the Pharisees, is a preface to a fifth and final speech, or is it a distinctive block of discourse material? The number, by the way, between 5 and 6 matters because, of course, 5 large blocks of material may intentionally echo the 5 books of the Pentateuch, the books of traditionally authored by Moses. We do also have in this Gospel an infancy narrative, which we did not see in Mark, and one that is balanced by a much longer and more detailed resurrection account at the close of the Gospel. In terms of geographic arrangement, we lose in Matthew that Markan movement back and forth between the two sides of the Sea of Galilee, in effect between Jewish and Gentile territory. However, we do have various movements, and so the bulk of Jesus' ministry is centered on Galilee, and then of course he moves towards Jerusalem, and that being a place of threat and of course of the Passion. Harrington also suggests that there is a thematic arrangement to this narrative. So he outlines it as you see here, the who and where of Jesus in the infancy narrative, and then the beginning of Jesus' activity is related and the Sermon on the Mount is preached. We then see Jesus' powerful deeds accompanied by his missionary discourse. The rejection of Jesus comes to the fore, and we hear the parables of the kingdom. Next we hear of more miracles, but also controversies and indications of the cross. And here we have a discourse which consists of advice to a divided community. And then finally we see opposition to Jesus intensifying, and we hear his discourse on the coming of the kingdom, one that is parallel to Mark's little apocalypse, but differs in a number of ways. And then finally we have the resurrection account found in chapters 26 and following. The Passion account. The Gospel has a theme of promise. It in fact begins and ends with the promise regarding God's presence among us in Jesus. So in the infancy narrative of Mark, Jesus is called Emmanuel, God who is with us. And then in chapter 28, at the end of the gospel, he promises to remain with us until the end of the age. There are typical formulae that are used in this gospel. From then on, Jesus began would be one example, marking Jesus' first public activity and journey towards Jerusalem. Another formula would be he went about. And then we have the fulfillment sayings. We have this happened to fulfill what was said in the prophet, usually Isaiah, but sometimes others. And many, many quotes from the Old Testament, again emphasizing the Jewish nature of this gospel. There are key themes that link the narratives that are of interest to Matthew. One is the question of righteousness. Now remember that in a Jewish Christian setting, righteousness doesn't have to do with looking down on others. It has to do with being in right relationship with God, and then therefore being in right relationship with nature and with others. He also uses the expression little faith. Remember in Mark how much emphasis there was on the misunderstandings of the disciples. Well, here they're described as having little faith. And that may in fact be a compliment. It's certainly better than no faith. But little ones also seems to be a term that Jesus would use for his community and for the Matthean community. And then we have that very biblical phrase, paying homage, which appears a number of times and again links the various narratives. Matthew represents an adaptation of Mark, so much of Mark is present in Matthew. However, there are edits and there is definitely new material. And in doing so, Matthew appears to be guided by both literary and theological motives. He sometimes compresses Mark to the essential, and he converts narrative into dialogue, making the story a little bit more vivid. In the first 12 chapters, he doesn't follow the Markan sequence very closely, but from chapter 13 on, he does so more carefully. And again, we've seen there are those large blocks of teaching material. So whereas, remember, Mark would simply say things like Jesus taught, or give a summary or a brief aphorism or statement of Jesus, Matthew's going to give a significant body of teaching. He also seems to have adapted Mark for a more Jewish Christian audience. So Mark probably had Jews in his community, but he seemed to have a majority of Gentiles. Remember, he had to explain Jewish customs to his listeners, whereas Matthew appears to be writing to a primarily Jewish Christian audience. So he's going to omit those unnecessary explanations in this setting. He's also going to be more attentive to the opponents of Jesus. Now, some of that attention, of course, is negative, but in other words, for Matthew, it's the internal Jewish dispute, which is very important. And of course, for Matthew also, we're going to see that the law and the observance of the law are important, much less so than for Mark, who seemed to have Jesus setting aside many of the ritual prescriptions, whereas in Matthew we're going to see Jesus pay greater attention and respect to those traditions.